very glad to see that it has received already a lot of media interest. The full report is available on our website. I just wanted to note that this event is being live streamed. This morning, we're honored to be joined by Prime Minister Erna Solberg of Norway, from whom we will be hearing very, very shortly, followed by a presentation by our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, and Sam McCullough, who is the head of our CCUS unit. Madam Prime Minister, the floor is yours, please.
And thank you very much for inviting me to address you today. I would also like to thank you, and Faith personally, for your untiring efforts to promote CCS as one of the solutions to our climate and energy problems. And I would like to congratulate the IEA on producing this important report. I think it clearly shows that we must step up our efforts to develop CCS as a viable climate technology. And of course, in my view, the timing of this launch could not have been better. On Monday this week, my government presented a white paper to the Norwegian Parliament proposing a final investment decision for a full-scale CCS project in Norway. And I think many of you will already know about the transport and storage parts of the project, the Northern Lights. We have called the total project Longship. The name was given to the ships that took the Vikings to distant shores more than a millennium ago. And of course, in the Longship project is intended to set up a complete CCS value chain, CO2 capture, transport and storage. The first capture project is a Heidelberg cement factory. The Northern Lights transport and storage infrastructure project is run by Equinor, Total and Shell. And the group is already in contact with a number of capture projects in Europe that may be able to use Northern Lights storage capacity. If additional funding can be obtained from other sources, such as the EU Innovation Fund, my government will also support a second capture project, a waste incineration plant in Oslo, partly owned by Fortum. These projects will involve investments totaling 2.3 billion euros. Back to the Longships. Those Longships of the Viking Age represented at that time innovation, a supreme ship technology. We believe the innovation and technology of today's Longship project will be crucial in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And while capture and storage in the Viking era generally meant looting, we are trying to bring home what you do not want to keep, the CO2. For this to be a success, of course, we need to see a wave of CCS projects in Europe and in other countries. Initially, I hope to see more capture projects around the North Sea and in Northern Europe, using the infrastructure we are now establishing. And after that, I hope there will be more CCS projects, both in the rest of Europe and globally, so that we drive down costs and improve performance. And we believe in the message of the IEA that we need CCS to achieve vital emission reductions in industry, and we are acting on it. We see the Longship as Norway's contribution to demonstrating and maturing a technology that will be needed to achieve the Paris goals. At the same time, we of course will be safeguarding jobs, welfare and value creation. And in launching Longship, we are showing that we are willing to take the lead, but we also hope that the rest of the world will follow. And I would also like to point out that CCS is the key to large-scale blue hydrogen production. And in June, the Norwegian government launched its hydrogen strategy. We are stepping up our efforts, and I'm happy to see that Norway is not alone. Our energy transition is a large and it's a complex undertaking. With our initiatives on CCS and hydrogen, Norway is taking important steps forward. But of course, as I said, we count on others to come after if this is going to be a success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister, for addressing thousands of people now. We just got the numbers around the world and many members of press. if I may, can I ask a couple of questions, Madam Prime Minister? First of all, you mentioned briefly in your speech that your country is a leader across many clean energy technologies. As far as I know, in terms of electric car sales in the world, Norway is #1. You are most of your electricity comes from hydropower, anyways, very clean there. Offshore wind, recently you pushed very strongly. You have a new hydrogen strategy, and now CCUS. We know that the first ever CCS project was again in Norway many years ago. Now you have the Longship. How does the CCUS fit within your broader climate goals and energy strategy of Norway? CCUS within that entire energy picture.
Well, I believe that CCUS is extremely important for us. It's still immature mitigation solutions in many ways. Our main focus is now on short-term emission reduction. We have a emission budget, of course, with our agreement with the European Union. But we believe that the CCUS will play a larger role towards 2050 to reach that target and our transition into being a low emission economy. And of course, what we now see is that it can mitigate emissions from industrial processes, such as the production of cement. I think cement production in the world accounts for 7% of all emissions. It's part of the industrial production, meaning that it's not just a shift from a new energy deliverer. 2/3 of the emissions comes from the process itself, meaning that you need to have other alternatives than just changing your energy balance. And so we believe that for those industrial projects, carbon capture and storage is going to be important for us. And then, of course, we are working on all of the other. Hydropower, offshore wind is, of course, important. And then we know that there is a possibility for blue hydrogen in the future based on natural gas if we also manage the CO2 emissions. And that's also a technology and industrial project for Norway for the future.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. Madam Prime Minister, of course, the Longship project, when you announced it, there's a lot of echo around the world, governments, many people, and we were all very happy. Now, government leadership for such a project, CCUS project, is of course critical. But we also need the support. We believe at the IEA, at least the private participation, the private sector being part of it. How do you think the Norway should partner with the industry to support the CCUS projects?
Well, I believe that the private partners are vital in finding the new solutions, innovate to cut the costs down. And that's why we in this project, of course, have have some of the strongest industrial and oil and petroleum sector actors that are participating. It's important to say also that Norway has stored CO2 for a long time in 2 different fields. So we know that this is a safe procedure. We know that the technology is there. What we now really have to work for is cutting costs so that it's a cost-efficient way of cutting emissions. And that's why we believe that the government has to take parts of the startup costs with this to make sure that the infrastructure are there. But of course, we believe that the CO2 prices will rise. And then there will be question of cost cutting is the question of innovation of industrial processes. It's something that businesses is much better than politicians are. So we really need them to participate.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. It is exactly what we believe, and our report shows that there is a growing momentum. Many industry players interested in CCUS projects, if, of course, governments put the right framework. My final question, if I may, Madam Prime Minister, we know how busy you are, but just one final question, since we have you and thousands of people following us. I mean, we believe at the IES, CCUS is definitely critical to reach our climate goals, and Norway has been active in sharing its experience with CCUS with the global community for decades. We need international cooperation here, and IEA, our organization being the Global Energy Authority, what do you suggest us, to me, my colleagues here, how we can increase the level of engagement and boost of CCUS? What do you suggest us to do, Madam Prime Minister?
But first of all, I think your earlier reports, which I have quoted heavily this week, on in fact saying that CCS is it's a more economically efficient way of cutting emissions for industries than what the alternatives will be without it, that it's a better economic, for the world and the global output. So having the knowledge, doing the analysis are important, but also I think to show that that these projects are functioning, that it's how and finding what type of incentives do we really need for businesses to capture more of their CO2 and for the storage facilities to live. I mean, we have to look at how are the next steps for cost reduction. And I think you can work with the best minds in the world to see what should be the global program for reaching these goals. As I said, our success criteria is that we don't do this alone, that there are other countries, other businesses that in fact also are capturing the CO2, and we now have a storage facility that they can use.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. You are right. Many countries are going in the same direction, and some of them are, I am sure, going to follow the footsteps of Norway. Madam Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us, your leadership. You mentioned the Vikings. They are famous for mastering long and difficult journeys, and we are counting on you, Madam Prime Minister, and Norway for the journey to address the climate change globally. Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister.
Thank you, and we are trying to behave a little bit more nicely in the world than the Vikings did. Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. We count on you. Thank you very much. Now, dear colleagues, after we hit the honor and the privilege of Madam Prime Minister, I would like to start with our presentation. I am going to share it with my colleague, Mrs. Sam McCulloch, who is in charge of our work in the carbon capture and storage. Now, before talking about the carbon capture and storage, I would like to tell you that even in these days, in this very grim year of 2020, where we had a lot of difficulty in terms of the health challenges and in terms, of course, the global economy going through a very, very difficult time, I am optimistic about our clean energy future, optimistic more than ever. Why? I would like to give you at least 4 reasons why I am now more optimistic than ever about our clean energy future. Number 1, solar and wind, especially offshore wind, the costs are coming down substantially. In many parts of the world, solar is becoming the cheapest source of electricity generation. This is number 1. It's not only in one country, it is going around the world, from the Vietnam to Brazil, from Middle East to Europe. This is number 1. Second, many of the clean energy transition technologies need upfront high investments. And in many cases, fuel is for free. And the world is going through a period where we will have ultra low interest rates. And this will facilitate the much needed upfront investments for the clean energy technologies. This is the second reason why I am hopeful. Third, governments around the world more and more committed to clean energy transition. Some of them are driven by addressing the climate change concerns, many of them. We have recently heard from China. Some of them are pushing the clean energy transitions to address the air pollution issue. Some of them are pushing it in order to have a good position in terms of their industry. And therefore, we see a growing government commitment. And fourth, we are seeing many companies, energy companies, are stepping up their efforts, oil companies, gas companies, and even some giant tech companies. And in this context, we see a great innovation push around the world, and CCUS is definitely one of them. If we can have our slides, the very first slide now, I will show you why we are thinking that the CCUS can play a very important role. First of all, the report we have, which we believe at the IEA, the most comprehensive global study to date on CCUS, we have identified a growing momentum behind CCUS. And this is, of course, very good news. And we have just heard the Prime Minister of Norway. And when we look at it in the last 2-3 years, there were more than 30 new projects announced. And if you look at if you don't believe the projects, you have to believe in money. Government and industry have committed about $4 billion only in 2020 up to now. September 2020, $4 billion have been committed by government and industry. Now, this is, of course, highlighting the growing momentum, growing interest in CCUS. And why does the IEA push CCUS? Why does the IEA thinks CCUS should be one of the priority technologies when it comes to addressing the climate change? Because at the IEA, we look at hydrogen, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, the electric cars, all the clean energy technologies, but CCUS, why specifically very important? I have 4 reasons to tell you why we think it is critical to reach our energy and climate goals. First of all, we have already, as we speak now, a huge existing energy infrastructure, power plants, industry, and in a normal world, they will be with us, many of them, 30, 40 years, and throughout their normal lifetime, they are going to emit emissions, as they have been doing since decades. So the issue is not only to push that the new infrastructure, power plants, industry, trucks, cars, whatever, are sustainable and clean. The issue is how do we deal with the existing power plants, existing industry? If we leave them as they are already going to eat up big chunks of our existing carbon budget. We can't leave it as it is. So therefore, CCUS is of critical importance to address the emissions coming from the existing energy infrastructure. Second one, CCUS can support our low carbon hydrogen production. We believe hydrogen will be critical in our push for clean energy transitions in transportation sector, buildings, industry, and CCUS, together with the electrolyzers, is a key way to produce hydrogen. We all know There are many countries have different views about many different technologies. Some like this one, the other doesn't like the other one. But every country nowadays loves hydrogen. And here, one of the ways to produce hydrogen is through CCUS. A third reason is, Madam Prime Minister mentioned, CCUS can be critical to address the emissions coming from heavy industries. And industry sector, mainly the iron, steel, cement, chemicals make about 20% of our emissions today. And you need high level of temperature, heat there. And therefore, CCUS will be critical here to address the emissions coming from these challenging sectors and to reduce them. And we heard from Madam Prime Minister the Longship and the cement issue. Now, these are three important roles that CCUS can play to reduce the emissions. But on top of that, we also know that CCUS can also help to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We may well need, the world may well need to remove the carbon from the atmosphere in order to provide the opportunity for us to deliver a net zero energy system. For these reasons, the CCUS critical role in terms of reducing the emissions and at the same time removing the existing emissions is a critical one. It is the reason IEA is leading the CCUS efforts globally, both in terms of our guidance partnership with governments as well as with industry, and it is the reason we have published this report today. Now, I am going to turn to my colleague, Mrs. Sam Kalek, who is the main author of this study and at the same time responsible for our CCUS work.
Thank you, Dr. Birrell, and good morning, everyone. So as Dr. Birrell has already indicated this morning, we've seen very significant new momentum for CCS in recent times. And this is very good news. This progress is very good news for climate goals. So for this report that we are releasing today, we have looked in a great deal of detail at a comprehensive range of CCUS technologies and applications. And this within a portfolio of more than 800 clean energy technologies that are available to support clean energy transitions. And from this analysis, we have identified these 4 strategic roles for CCS. Now, I'd like to talk about these in more detail, but first it's useful to get a picture of where CCS is today. So CCS is not necessarily a new technology. Today, we have more than 20 facilities around the world applying CCS. Now, some of these have been operating since the 1970s and 1980s, and the vast majority of projects are associated with natural gas processing. This is where CO2 can be captured at relatively low cost. Now, since 2010, the diversity of CCS applications has increased. We now have CCS being applied to coal-fired power generation and steel production, for example. But to meet net zero goals, the role for CCS would need to expand to a much broader range of applications. Now, these span coal, gas, and biomass-based power generation, heavy industry applications in cement, steel, and chemicals, hydrogen production. We can also extract or pull CO2 directly from the air through direct air capture technologies, or DAC. So much of the captured CO2 will need to be stored in a net zero pathway, but we can also use the captured CO2 in a range of applications. This includes using CO2 in combination with clean hydrogen to produce synthetic fuels. And this could actually be an important solution for decarbonising the aviation sector. So the diversity of roles for CCS means it can contribute directly or indirectly to emissions reductions in virtually all parts of the global energy system. So looking in detail at the 4 strategic opportunities for CCS that we've identified, as the Executive Director has indicated, the first one is really about existing assets. We will not meet our climate goals without finding a solution for emissions from the world's existing energy assets, and early action is needed. So in the next decade, more than half of CCS deployment is dedicated to solving this issue. Many of today's power and industrial plants, so this is steel, cement, chemical plants, have only been built in the last 2 decades. And if these facilities were to continue to operate to the end of their technical lives, they would still emit more than 600 billion tonnes of CO2. So this is around 17 years worth of current annual emissions. So this would leave virtually no room for any new emissions generating assets in any sector, which is simply not realistic. So it may be possible to change the way many of these plants operate, to use them less or to implement efficiency measures, for example, or they can be retired early where it's economic to do so. But CCS is the only technology solution that would allow these existing power and industrial facilities to continue to operate and to continue to contribute to economic development or energy security objectives, but in a way that's compatible with deep emissions reductions. So coal-fired power generation is indeed a big part of the CCS retrofit opportunity, given the scale of the existing fleet, particularly in Asia. But retrofits to industrial plant, including cement, steel, and chemicals, will also be needed in the next decade in a pathway that's consistent with a net zero goal. The second strategic opportunity is around the production of low carbon hydrogen. So hydrogen, as the Executive Director has already indicated, is really a critical and very versatile solution for clean energy transitions. Today, around 75 million tonnes of hydrogen is produced globally, and virtually all of this is from natural gas. So this is associated with significant emissions, the equivalent of the annual emissions of the UK and Indonesia combined. In a net zero transition, the role of hydrogen increases substantially to more than 500 million tonnes a year. This meets demand from a range of sectors across the energy system, from industry, from buildings, from power, transport. And this huge scaling up of production, in principle, can be supported by 2 main low carbon or low emission pathways. One being electrolyzers that rely on renewable electricity, and the other is fossil-based hydrogen production with carbon capture and storage. So today, the costs of producing hydrogen with CCS can be as low as half that of electrolyzers in some regions. Now, of course, we do expect the costs of electrolyzers to fall significantly, but even with that in mind, the CCS will continue to be a cost-effective solution for regions that have access to low-cost fossil fuels and also geological storage. Now, today, 7 plants around the world, or 7 hydrogen facilities, are already applying CCS to their production. This includes the Quest project in Canada, which has now stored more than 5 million tonnes of CO2. CCS also offers a solution for some of the most challenging emissions across the energy system, including in heavy industry, which today accounts for around 20% of emissions. In sectors such as steel and chemicals production, CCS is actually a cost-effective and relatively mature abatement option in some cases. But I want to particularly highlight the role of CCS in cement production. So here, CCS is currently indispensable. Cement, as the Prime Minister mentioned earlier, cement accounts for around 7% of global emissions. This is 2.5 times the emissions from all aviation transport. So it's a significant challenge. In cement, we have few scalable technology solutions. So very robust material efficiency measures could reduce emissions from the sector by around 40%, but deep emissions reductions will rely on CCUS. Now, this is primarily because most of the emissions from cement are process emissions. This means they're not associated with the use of fossil fuels or the burning of fossil fuels, but they're an inherent and a currently unavoidable part of making cement. So capturing and storing these emissions is really the only practical mitigation option. Yet this is also an area where CCS has yet to gain significant traction. There are currently no cement facilities with CCS operating, but 3 are in planning, and one of those is the Norcem cement plant that is part of Norway's Longship Project. Finally, net zero targets inherently recognise that it may not be possible to completely avoid or eliminate all emissions. So these emissions must be balanced by carbon removal options, and this is really at the heart of net zero goals. So for example, in our sustainable development scenario, when net zero emissions are reached, there are still around 3 billion tonnes of emissions remaining, primarily in long distance transport and heavy industry. These emissions are balanced or otherwise offset by carbon capture and storage, and in particular by bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture with permanent storage. This removes CO2 from the atmosphere and has a net negative carbon equation. So these are key technology-based approaches for carbon removal that can enable the energy system to become net zero. So there are other options outside the energy system, which include nature-based solutions such as afforestation and reforestation. And often while carbon removal is looked at as a long-term solution, in our report, we do highlight that this can actually be part of the portfolio of technologies and measures that we deploy in the near term on a pathway to net zero emissions. So there is already a commercial facility in the US today that is capturing CO2 from bioethanol production and storing that CO2. There are now also plans, also in the US, to develop a large-scale direct air capture facility, which could be operating by the mid-2020s. So these 4 strategic roles for CCS in clean energy transitions will require a major acceleration in progress. In the next decade, CCS deployment would need to expand by a factor of 20, requiring urgent and sustained action from governments and industry. So recognizing that policies and responses will obviously need to be tailored to regional conditions and preferences, we have highlighted 4 high-level priorities for governments and industry to accelerate progress with CCS. Firstly, create the conditions for CCS investment. This is by valuing emissions reductions and providing direct support for early CCS projects. Secondly, targeting the development of industrial hubs with shared CO2 storage infrastructure or transport infrastructure. So the availability of infrastructure is really key to unlocking the potential of CCS, and shared transport and storage networks can actually reduce the cost and the complexity of CCS. Identify and encourage the development of CO2 storage. Our analysis highlights that the theoretical potential for geological storage is vast and well in excess of what is likely to be needed, but more detailed site characterization and assessment is required. Finally, boost innovation for critical technologies. So although some technologies for CCS are already mature, we need a major boost in innovation in key applications in order to reduce costs and to ensure that these technologies are commercially available within the decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your presentation, and Dr. Birol. So next we are going to move to the Q&A part of this session. We're going to take a very, very short break while we solicit your questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom application. We'll just take a 1-minute break and then come back for the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, thank you. We're back, and thank you for the questions you've been sending us. A lot of questions. We probably won't have time to go through them, but we'll try to put them together so that Dr. Birol and Sam can answer as many as possible. So by grouping them, I will start with a question from Frank Kane from Arab News. Saudi Arabia has made CCUS a core part of its energy transition strategy. What challenges do you see for hydrocarbon economies in adopting and advancing CCUS? Linking that to a question by Robert Hodgson from ENDS Europe, asking essentially whether CCS is driven by fossil fuel producing companies, or whether, as some argue, CCS should be treated strictly as a solution of a last resort for decarbonizing heavy parts of industry. And then two more questions. One from Tom Brun from ISIS. The IEA mentioned in a recent report the many challenges facing a chemical sector transition to lower, cleaner emissions. Does CCUS offer a solution to that? Perhaps, Dr. Birol, we can start with these three questions and then move to Sam.
Okay, let me go to the first two and leave the third one to my colleague, Sam McCulloch. Now, at the IEA, we are an energy organization. We love energy, but we do not like emissions. So we shouldn't mix two things together. Energy is good, emissions are bad. If we can have oil, gas, solar, renewables, wind, whatever it is, their energy for our economic growth, for having a much comfortable life, to progress socially, it is very good. What we want is that we want to reduce the emissions. So if these oil and gas producing countries, such as you mentioned the question, Saudi Arabia, makes a big push for carbon capture and utilization technology, this is more than welcome. Because our problem is not with the energy, our problem with the emissions. The issue is here, we have to see whether or not these technologies will help to reduce the emissions in a timely manner and in a significant manner. I know that this Sunday there is a G20 energy ministerial meeting hosted by Saudi Arabia this year, G20, and CCS is definitely a key agenda item. At least IEA will make sure that it will be a major agenda item for the G20 energy ministers. Again, we think for the oil and gas producers, for oil and gas industry, it is a very important task and technology to push in order to see a marriage between the availability of energy and reaching our climate goals. I see another question about the cost. And what was the question about cost, Jet, there? It is, okay, if you go up, I think, no? Okay, there was a, this is a question about when will the CCUS will be commercially viable. Now, we hope it will be commercially viable this decade, because as my colleague, Mrs. McCulloch said, in order to bring the emissions to a net zero trajectory, the CCS projects need to increase by a factor of 20. In fact, if we broaden the scope, our Energy Technology Perspectives report tells us that in order to reach our net zero goals between now and 2050, about half of the technologies that will reduce the emissions are not commercially viable. So half of those technologies are not, 50% are not commercially viable. This is a major, major challenge, and CCUS is one of them. What needs to be done here to bring the cost down? As we have seen, solar costs come down, the wind came down. Offshore wind is coming down very quickly. What needs to be done is government support. It can be a carbon price, it can be a subsidy, as we have seen in the United States, a 45Q, it can be a tax credit. There is a need for kickoff support from the governments, but we hope to see that this decade it will be commercially viable. It has to be commercially viable if we want to reach our climate goals.
Thank you. On the question of the Longship project. So the Longship project in Norway is actually sort of 3 projects that the Norwegian government is coordinating. There's a capture facility at a cement plant, a capture facility at a waste to energy plant, and then the Northern Lights CO2 storage project, which is proposing to store up to 5 million tonnes of CO2 deep under the North Sea. And this storage project is potentially available for other facilities across Europe to access for storage. So back in May, the project proponents for the Northern Lights project made a conditional investment decision. This is Shell, Total, and Equinor, who committed to spending at least $700 million on this facility, subject to also receiving government support, and that support has come through this week.
Thank you very much, Sam. We're going to take 2 more questions. Again, we're sort of running out of time and we have too many questions to go through. So perhaps these 2 questions for you, Dr. Birol. First one, China announced the intention to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. What is your view on this announcement? And then a second question from Satoru Mizoguchi from the Japanese Press Club. According to the IEA, technologies and CCS are gaining momentum. The question here is, again, what is behind this acceleration in CCUS after years of slow progress?
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with our Japanese press question. What is the driver behind the acceleration of the CCUS and in general the clean energy technologies progress? First, I believe first and foremost government support. Many governments are now taking clean energy transitions very seriously. In Europe, we have a European Green Deal, which gives a strong support to clean energy technologies. In many other countries, the innovation, such as the ones in North America. In Japan, Australia, we see the hydrogens getting a big push. So government commitments, government support is very important. Governments are doing this for 2 reasons, basically. One of them is to reach the climate targets, and some of them are doing in order to make sure that their industry, domestic industry, is a part of the next industry revolution. So position their industries in a right way in the competition which is coming, which will include clean energy technology. This can be electric cars, this can be CCUS, this can be solar, this can be hydrogen and others. So we see a lot of governments are pushing it very strongly, and also the companies are stepping up in order to be part of the clean energy transitions. On one hand, pressure from their shareholders, from citizens, but on the other hand, they also themselves want to position themselves in a advantageous way for the next phase to come. In terms of China question, China announced intention to reach carbon neutrality by the year 2060 this week. What is our view? First of all, the question from our media colleague is not exactly that, not by the year 2060. There's an option that may be before 2060. I hope it is before 2060. And this, of course, very welcome from the Chinese government, as China being the largest emitter of the world, and we just talk. My colleague, Mrs. McCulloch, explained a big chunk of the existing assets, the industrial assets, iron, steel, chemicals, cement in China. There are a huge amount of those assets, and they are very young. If they were to run, operate, make money throughout their technical life, CCUS will be a key technology, if not the most important technology to address those emissions. So therefore, if Chinese government announces soon the legs of these policies and targets, how to reach them, I am sure CCUS will get an important emphasis, which I hope to see. We are happy to see the Chinese announcement to reach those climate targets, but we will be even happier to see the details of how to reach those targets. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Birol. So this is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for all the questions. We still have a number of questions we will get back to. If you have other questions, please email us at press@iea.org. And on a scheduling note, we have a number of reports coming up in the next few weeks, and Iron and Steel Roadmap in a few days, and also the World Energy Outlook on October 13th. So we hope to see you back here for those events and others. Thank you very much.